This is lecture number 35 in the series The ABCs of Communism, The Empire Strikes Back, part of this series, and today we're talking about Panama, which has been the focus of U.S. foreign policy for well over a century, actually going back into the late 1800s. But first of all, I want to take a look at the geology of the Isthmus of Panama, because that's very important, and then to the climatic regime, and finally the biological regime, the geography, and once we have that setting, we'll move on to the social and cultural evolution of the Isthmus, which is historically known as the Isthmus of Darien or the Isthmus of Panama. It's a narrow strip of land that lies between the Caribbean and the Pacific Ocean, linking North and South America. It contains the country of Panama and the Panama Canal. The Isthmus was formed 12 to 15 million years ago when the Central American Peninsula collided slowly with the plate carrying South America. And the actual process featured the merger of the southern continental protrusion of North America with the South American landmass. Now, this major geological event separated the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and caused the creation of the Gulf Stream. A body of water called the Central American Seaway separated the continents of North and South America, allowing the waters of the Pacific and Atlantic Ocean to mix freely. Beneath that surface, two plates of the Earth's crust were colliding. Now, you'll recall from our earlier geological discussions that the Earth consists of a core, which is solid in the inside, liquid in the outside of the core, and then a liquid mantle. Think of it as a liquid, a mantle of rock, which most of the Earth is constructed of, which has a flow within it. We're going to talk about that in a moment, because this flow becomes important when we're taking a look at the shape of South America. And then at the top we have a thin layer, a few miles of crust. Well, by a few miles I mean anywhere from 10 to 40 miles of crust that is broken up into a series of plates that float on top of this liquid mantle. Okay, now the plate carrying the South American continent was moving slowly northward, and it impacted the plate that was carrying North and Central America. The Central American part was a peninsula. These two eventually connected. Now, as they did, this forced the Cocos plate under the Caribbean plate. The pressure and heat caused by this collision led to the formation of underwater volcanoes originating from the melting in each of the plates. So these volcanoes are not coming, this is not magma coming from the mantle itself. It's coming from the fact that as these plates collide, they create the melting within each of them, and that's where the volcanoes come from. The pressure and heat caused by this collision led to the formation of underwater volcanoes originating from the melting in each of these plates. Some of these volcanoes grew large enough to form islands as early as 15 million years ago. And meanwhile, the ongoing movement of the two tectonic plates was also pushing up the seafloor. Now, eventually this forced some volcanoes and their surrounding areas to become islands above the sea level. And over time, massive amounts of sediment from North and South America filled the gaps between the newly forming islands. Over millions of years, the sediment deposits added to the islands until the gaps were completely filled. By at least 4.5 million years ago, there was an isthmus formed between North and South America. And a recent article in April of this year, that is 2015, in Science magazine, reports that zircon crystals have been found and dated in the middle of a Miocene bedrock. So that is the early part of the Cenozoic era. This happened in northern Colombia by 10 million years ago, and therefore it would appear that instead of islands, a full isthmus between the North and South American continents had formed where the Central American Seaway had been previously. Okay, scientists believe that the formation of the Isthmus of Panama is one of the most important geological events in the last 60 million years. However, only a small sliver of land relative to the size of the continents, this isthmus had enormous impact on the Earth's climate and environment. First, by shutting down the flow of water between the two oceans, the land bridge rerouted ocean currents in both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Now, that sets up the extant weather regime. These Atlantic currents were forced northward and eventually settled into a new current pattern that we now call the Gulf Stream. With warm Caribbean waters flowing toward the northeast Atlantic, the climate of northwestern Europe and eastern North America grew substantially warmer. It is the directly affected atmospheric circulation, rather than the Gulf Stream, that results in the pronounced temperature differential between Europe and eastern North America. Evaporation in the tropical Atlantic and Caribbean caused freshwater vapor to enter the atmosphere, while leaving behind salty water. The trade winds that blow from east to west carried the water vapor and deposited it in the Pacific by precipitation. Therefore, the Atlantic became saltier than the Pacific. Each of these changes helped establish the global ocean circulation pattern that's in place today. Now, in short, the Isthmus of Panama directly and indirectly influenced ocean and atmospheric circulation patterns, which regulated patterns of rainfall, which in turn sculpted the landscapes of Europe and North America. The creation of this Panamanian landmass and the subsequent warm, wet weather over northern Europe resulted in the formation of a large Arctic ice cap and contributed to the subsequent ice ages. Warm currents can in this way also lead to glacier formation. So heated air flowing over the warm Gulf Stream holds more moisture, and the result is increased precipitation that contributes to snowpack. Okay, now, the extant biological regime. The formation of the Isthmus of Panama also played a major role in biodiversity on the planet. The creation of the Isthmus of Panama made a land bridge for animals and plants migrating between the two continents. In paleontology, we call this the Great American Interchange. In North America, the possum, armadillo, and porcupine all trace back to ancestors that came across the land bridge from South America. The ancestors of bears, cats, dogs, horses, llamas, and raccoons crossed the isthmus heading into South America. Interestingly, those South American mammals they encountered went extinct. North American mammals were, 1, more accustomed to competition, and 2, better suited to the cooling climate. The Panamanian biosphere, because of the connecting bridge between two vast land masses, is filled with overlapping fauna and flora from both North and South America. Consequently, in Panama there are over 978 species of birds. The tropical climate also encouraged a myriad of large and brightly colored species of insects, snakes, birds, fish, and reptiles. Divided along its length by a mountain range, the isthmus weather is wet on the Atlantic or the Caribbean side, with a clear division into wet and dry seasons on the Pacific side. Geographically, Panama is located in Central America, bordering both the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean between Colombia and Costa Rica. It mostly lies between latitudes 7 and 10 degrees north and longitudes 77 and 83 degrees west. Its location on the Isthmus of Panama is strategic. By 2000, Panama controlled the Panama Canal, which connects the Atlantic Ocean and the Caribbean Sea to the north of the Pacific Ocean. Panama's total area as a nation is about 76,000 square kilometers. The dominant feature of Panama's landform is the central spine of mountains and hills that forms the continental divide. The divide does not form part of the great mountain chains of North America, and only near the Colombian border are there highlands related to the Andean system of South America. However, the spine that forms the divide is the highly eroded arch of an uplift from the sea bottom in which peaks were formed by volcanic intrusions in ways that we just discussed. The mountain range of the divide is called the Cordillera de Talamanca near the Costa Rican border, or the Talamanca Cordillera in English. Farther east, it becomes the Serranía de Tabasara, and the portion of it closer to the lower saddle of the isthmus, where the Panama Canal is located, is often called the Sierra de Veraguas. As a whole, the range between Costa Rica and the canal is generally referred to by geographers as the Cordillera Central, or Central Cordillera. The highest point in the country is the Volcan Baru, the Baru volcano, which rises to 11,401 feet. A nearly impenetrable jungle forms the Darien Gap between Panama and Colombia, where Colombian guerrillas and drug dealers are currently operating and have been for the last century. This and forest protection movements create a break in the Pan American Highway, which otherwise forms a complete road from Alaska to Patagonia. When we get into discussion of the most modern era of drug trafficking, both for Panama and Colombia, you'll see that this has been kind of an ideal place for many, many decades for drug traffickers to build a base from which they can travel further in different directions. And we'll go into that more later on. And it's fairly easy to protect because you can't get a large numbers of men in there by land, and so it's hard for anybody to fight them. Panama's wildlife holds the most diversity of all of the countries in Central America. It is home to many South American species as well as North American wildlife. Now, surprisingly, there are nearly 500 rivers that lace Panama's rugged landscape, surprisingly because it's such a small country. Most of these rivers are unnavigable, but many originate as swift highland streams, meander into valleys, and form coastal deltas. However, the Rio Chagres is one of the few wide rivers and a source of enormous hydroelectric power. The river is located in central Panama. The central part of that river is dammed by the Gatun Dam and forms Gatun Lake, an artificial lake that constitutes part of the Panama Canal. The lake was created between 1907 and 1913 by the building of the Gatun Dam across the Chagres River. When it was created, Gatun Lake was the largest man-made lake in the world, and its dam was the largest earth dam in the world. It drains northwest into the Caribbean. The Campia and Madden lakes, also filled from the Rio Chagres, provide hydroelectricity for the entire area of the canal zone. The Rio Chepo, another source of hydroelectric power, is one of more than 300 rivers emptying into the Pacific Ocean. These Pacific-oriented rivers are longer and slower running than those of the Caribbean side. Their bases are also more extensive. One of the longest is the Rio Tuira, which flows into the Golfo de San Miguel and is the nation's only river navigable by large vessels. Now, as for the harbors, the Caribbean coastline is marked by several good natural harbors. However, Cristobal, at the Caribbean terminus of the canal, had the only important port facilities in the late 1980s. The numerous islands of the archipelago de Bocas del Toro, near the beaches of Costa Rica, provide an extensive natural roadstead and shield the banana port of Almirante. There are over 350 of the San Blas Islands near Colombia, and these are strung out for more than 80 miles along the sheltered Caribbean coastline. Currently, the terminal ports located at each end of the canal, Panama Canal, are namely the Port of Cristobal and the Port of Balboa, and these are ranked second and third respectively in Latin America in terms of the number of container units handled, by which we mean these big containers you see placed on container ships by cranes that carry all kinds of stuff within them, are numbered. And well, at any rate, the Port of Balboa covers 182 hectares, contains 4 berths for containers and 2 multi-purpose berths. In total, the berths are over 2,400 meters long with a depth of 15 meters. The Port of Balboa has 18 super post-Panamax and Panamax key cranes and 44 gantry cranes. The Port of Balboa also contains 2,100 square meters of warehouse space. The ports of Cristobal, encompassing the container terminals of Panama Ports Cristobal, Manzanillo International Terminal, and Colón Container Terminal, handled 2,210,000 tons of container equipment in 2009, second only to Port of Santos, Brazil, in Latin America. Excellent deep-water ports capable of accommodating VLCC, that is, very large crude oil carriers, are located at Charco Azul, Chiriqui on the Pacific, and Chiriqui Grande, Bocas del Toro on the Atlantic, near Panama's western border with Costa Rica. The Trans-Panama Pipeline runs across the isthmus with a length of 131 kilometers and has been operating between Charco Azul and Chiriqui Grande since 1979. As for the climate, Panama has, as you would imagine, a tropical climate. Temperatures are uniformly high, as is the relative humidity, and there is little seasonal variation. Diurnal ranges are low on a typical dry season day in the capital city. The early morning minimum would be about 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and the afternoon maximum about 86 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature seldom exceeds 89 degrees Fahrenheit for more than a short time. Temperatures on the Pacific side of the isthmus are somewhat lower than on the Caribbean side, and breezes tend to rise after dusk in most parts of the country. Temperatures are markedly cooler in the higher parts of the mountain ranges, and frosts occur in the Cordillera de Talamanca in western Panama. Climatic regions are determined less based on temperature than on rainfall, which varies regionally from 51 inches to more than 118 inches per year. Almost all of the rain falls during the rainy season, which is usually from April to December, but varies in length from 7 to 9 months. In general, rainfall is much heavier on the Caribbean than on the Pacific side of the Continental Divide. The annual average in Panama City is little more than half of that in Colón. Although rainy seasons, thunderstorms are common, the country is outside of the hurricane belt proper. Panama's tropical environment supports an abundance of plants. Forests dominate, interrupted in places by grasslands, scrub, and crops. Although nearly 40% of Panama is still wooded, deforestation is a continuing threat in the rain-drenched woodlands. Tree cover has been reduced by more than 50% since the 1940s. Subsistence farming, widely practiced in the northeastern jungles to the southwestern grasslands, consists largely of corn, bean, and tuber plots. Mangrove swamps occur along parts of both coasts, with banana plantations occupying deltas near Costa Rica. In many places, a multi-canopied rainforest borders the swamp on one side of the country and extends to the lower reaches of slopes in the other. Panama today is the country to the south of Costa Rica in Central America, and as such it is situated as the last Central American land bridge link from North to South America. Panama is bordered by Costa Rica and the Caribbean in the north, and to Colombia and the Pacific Ocean in the south. Until the U.S. rulers decided to build the Trans-Isthmus Canal, Panama was the northernmost province of the Republic of Colombia. Colombia lost this province to U.S. armed takeover in 1903. The Panamanian capital and largest city is Panama City, whose metro area is home to nearly half of the country's 3.5 million people. Now, we'll go do what we usually do, which is go back to the primitive communist period and take a look at the fact that the original indigenous peoples in Panama were fully developed Homo sapiens, and they had to have arrived in Panama earlier than 50,000 years ago, given the dates in Brazil. The primitive communist hunting and gathering bands that stayed in Panama had then undergone autochthonous sociocultural evolution from primitive communism into the higher stages, meaning they had gone from hunting, gathering, bands and tribes and tribal agriculture through the chiefdom transition and then entered the servitude epoch. Again, onward and upward indigenous people of the primitive communists, that is hunting, gathering, and tribal agricultural varieties, originally inhabited the area we know as Panama. These people in the Panama area then entered the chiefdom levels of sociocultural evolution, and eventually they came into the servitude epoch also autochthonously. That's the epic of slavery, feudalism, and capitalism. And of course, they entered it in the stage of slavery, which was cut short by the arrival of the Spanish feudalist Ronin. Now we move to an outline of the recorded history in Panama. You remember the difference between prehistory and history is the invention of writing, wherever that may be. So, in this particular case, the invention of writing would have occurred in Mesoamerica before the arrival of the Spaniards, but the Catholic priests destroyed all of the written records that had been established by the Aztecs, and so there are, at last count, only 5 remaining books of the Aztec period in the world, thanks to the Catholic Church. At any rate, so now we're stuck with having to reconstruct that language in other ways. But as far as the outline of the recorded history of Panama is concerned, we have lots of data about that. Now, after the conquest of Peru by the Spanish Ronin, that conquest in Peru began in 1532. The entire area of what is now Panama was part of Spain's Panama colony. Panama had come under direct rule from Madrid as soon as the Pizarro brothers and their group of Ronin adventurers reported that the Peruvian natives had silver, and they reported that in 1528. Now, after the Ronin conquest of the Peruvian Empire of the Incas that began in 1532, the Panama colony remained the most important colony of the Spanish Empire. Why was that? It continued to be so until the collapse of the Bourbons and Napoleonic regimes in Madrid that was finalized in 1850. And the reason was twofold. First of all, it was the connection to Peru. So for Madrid, they would send ships to Panama and then cross the isthmus on foot, board other ships, go to Panama, and there they would get the silver and gold that was being mined there in Peru and bring it back the same way. And the other is the Spanish galleons would go from Madrid, well, probably from Cadiz in Spain to Panama colony, cross the area, the isthmus, get on what were called Manila galleons, which were monstrous big ships, go all the way to Manila, where they would load up on Chinese and Filipino goods. Manila was the route into China. So that was the reason that Panama now has become the most important single part of the Spanish Empire. And it was that way until the collapse of the Napoleonic regime in 1815 and the Congress of Vienna. Now, independence came to Panama when the Panama colony broke away from Spain 400 years later in 1821. At that time, Panama joined the Union of Nueva Granada, Ecuador, and Venezuela, named at that time the Republic of Gran Colombia. We discussed this once before in Chapter 33. I won't go over that right now. When Gran Colombia dissolved in 1831, Panama and Nueva Granada remained joined, eventually becoming the Republic of Colombia. With the decision of the United States to build the Panama Canal, the U.S. took Panama from Colombia forcibly and had Panama secede from Colombia officially in 1903. Subsequently, the U.S. government built the Panama Canal using the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The construction took the decade of 1904 to 1914. Now, in 1977, an agreement was signed with the Panama government and the government of the USA for the transfer of the Panama Canal Zone from the Panamanian regime to the U.S. And thereafter, the U.S. claimed ownership of the Panama Canal until the end of the 20th century. After many violent struggles, the Panamanian people took ownership of the canal from the gringos on the 31st of December, 1999. Okay, going back to the primitive communist period, archaeologists have traditionally organized the ancient cultures of Panama into 3 regions. The western region of Panama, that includes the eastern portion of Chiriquí and the Boca del Toro areas divided by the Atlantic and Pacific coastal zones. These 2 zones maintained close contact and developed similar cultural patterns. Diagnostic archaeological sites are La Pitaya, Cerro Brujo, Bariles, and Isla Palenque. Then there's the central region of Panama, which is the most studied area of that country, and it includes the regions of Veraguas, Cocle, and the Parita Bay. And what is most important there in terms of archaeological sites are the sedentary village tribal agricultural life sites that are dated to as early as 2500 BC in the areas closest to the coast. And diagnostic sites are also Las Huacas, Monagrillo, El Indio, La Mula, Cerro Magote, Sitio Sierra, Sitio Conte, Guariquito, El Atillo, Agua Dulce, Shelter, and Cueva de los Ladrones, Cave of the Thieves. And then there finally is the eastern region, which is the least known of the three regions. That includes the territories between the Colombian border and the Panama Canal, specifically the Darien and Panama areas, which I was just talking about, which are really thick jungles. If you've ever gone to Panama, people will probably offer you to take a trip to the northern part of the Darien area, which is well worth going on. But you have to be ready to encounter all kinds of things like snakes falling out of trees and giant spiders and alligators and crocodiles. And anyway, this is an area of intense rainforestation and habitable traditionally only by indigenous peoples and now by drug traffickers largely. At the time of the Spanish Roman conquest of the Isthmus, there were societies organized as simple and advanced theocratic chiefdoms. The Ronin never did succeed in the enslavement of these people, nor later was Madrid able to effect establishment of Spanish garrisons. The eastern region was an important point of communication and trade between South America and the northern region of Central America and Mesoamerica. Diagnostic sites are Aguas Buenas, Lake Madden, Palo Seco, Playa Velado, Miraflores, and Panama Viejo. Now, let's take a look at the advanced lithic stage in Panama's prehistoric chronology. Human occupation of the Isthmus area had to have predated the advanced lithic period. We know that because people from the first wave of New World occupiers had to pass through Panama on their way to both the Pacific and Atlantic coasts of South America, and people had arrived in Brazil by at least 55,000 years ago, and on the Pacific coast of Chile and Peru and the adjacent highlands of the Andes by 22,000 years ago, as we discussed last time in our lecture series on Latin America. At any rate, this migration gave rise autochtonously to advanced lithic cultures for which we have good archaeological evidence in the form of diagnostic projectile points. There are three of these diagnostic projectile point traditions. The first originates in the U.S. Southwest, by which we mean that area of Arizona, New Mexico, and the bordering parts of Colorado and Utah, and the bordering parts of northern Sonora Desert cultures. And these are the fluted point traditions of Clovis and Folsom, if you want to take a look at pictures of those. Then there's the Maracaibo, Venezuela Center, where we have what are called bipointed lanceolate leaf-shaped points. And there's finally the fish-tailed points from the coast of South America that get younger as they move from their oldest dated points in Chile up the coast of South America. So all three of these advanced lithic diagnostic New World originating cultural projectile point traditions have managed to make their way into Panama. So you've got all three of them there. In summary, the lithic stage groups were socially organized into primitive communism of hunting and gathering bands. In Panama, at the Lake Madden site, the stone tool complex includes these fluted points of the North American tradition, this Magelloid point tradition, which is what we call the fish-tailed points, and these are projectile points, that is arrow and spear points, that have fish-like tails. You'll see pictures of them in many different places. The latter is the diagnostic of Pacific coastal South America, the advanced lithic horizon sites, and in short, both diagnostic New World and advanced lithic traditions are known from the lithic phases of the Lake Madden archaeological site. And those date from 12,000 to 10,000 years ago. Now, in the subsequent early pre-ceramic period that dates from 10,000 to 7,000 years ago, people practiced hunting, plant collection, and fishing. Many sites of this period are caves and rock shelters used temporarily. A diagnostic site is that of Cueva de los Vampiros, the Cave of the Vampires. This is a proto-archaic stage, and it's a stage of broad-spectrum wild resource exploitation. This is followed by the late pre-ceramic period of 7,000 to 4,900 years ago. This is the archaic stage settlements that are located on the Panamanian coast. These include rock shelters, shell mounds, and some open sites. There's a broad spectrum of wild resource exploration featuring hunting, fishing, collection of crabs and shellfish, and the collection of aquatic and terrestrial plants. Proof of this subsistence pattern is seen also in the form of the stone tool kits and other kinds of tools specialized in the exploitation of a wide variety of resources. This includes the appearance of grinding stones and axes. A diagnostic site is Cerro Mangote, where corn cultivation is dated to 1500 BC. By this time, all people lived in small villages. Ceramics appear on the coast of the western region and Monagrillo. Diagnostic sites, in addition to Cerro Mangote, are La Mula, a large nucleated village, Zapotal, El Limon, Goncamayo, and Playa Benalo. Late Ceramic Period 1, that is the period from 3000 BC to AD 750, is the tribal agricultural stage, where the economy also evolves into simple chiefdoms by 5,000 years ago, that is 3000 BC. And from now on we're going to switch to the Christian chronology, since so much of New World archaeology has been presented in a BC AD form. Soon this period of tribal, agricultural, primitive, communist, and early simple chiefdom stages evolves into the advanced theocratic chiefdom stage. You'll notice that these stages we've been talking about throughout this lecture series, throughout your textbook, are universal and worldwide without exception. The latter features the appearance of large, permanent maize cultivating. By maize we're talking about corn, cultivating villages while continuing the extensive exploitation of hunting and aquatic resources. In other words, by AD 500, simple chiefdoms had evolved into socially ranked societies, with priest and priestess-run ceremonial centers as the centerpiece of public architecture. This is the proof of the appearance of advanced theocratic chiefdoms as a stage in sociocultural evolution. And I'll again bring to your attention Mel Gibson's great movie Apocalypto, which is a perfect recreation of an advanced theocratic chiefdom on the verge of becoming a kingdom, that is, a primitive state. Kingdoms. Increasingly, social differentiation is also proven in burial types and funerary inclusions. Human sacrifice proved by mass burials located around the internment of ruling individuals proves the emergence of classes and the state. These new social relations are reflected in a new kind of polity, the kingdom. Classes have emerged from ranks, that is, people have differential access, title deed, some have title deed of ownership to the means of production, and armed force is now in their hands in the form of men who are permanently hired as thugs to protect the interests of the new ruling class. Ruler burials were accompanied by luxury items, including bichrome and polychrome pottery with zoomorphic and geometric motifs, and a wide array of tools used for stone jewelry and stone carving. And gold appears by AD 500 in ruling class burials. Diagnostic sites of this stage in Panama include El Atillo, Sitio Conte, Sitio Sierra, Las Huacas, Panama Viejo, and El Caño. Now, theirs is the late ceramic period 2 that goes from AD 750 to roughly the time of contact in 1510. Class society as developed in the previous period continues, as do chiefdom societies, both soon to be encountered by the Spanish Ronin. At that time, kings ruled the region with large armies. Economic resources were obtained through interregional exchange, as described by ethnohistoric sources. Class leadership was displayed through gold ornaments, weaponry, and painted items. This extends to the inclusion of these items in funerary urns and the elaborate burials and artificial mounds. The end of the period comes via the Spanish Ronin conquest in 1510. This marks the beginning of the Spanish Empire colonial era. So you see, before the Spaniards got to Mexico, they had already, Columbus had already been exploring this isthmus coast. This marks the beginning of the Spanish Empire colonial era, and diagnostic sites of this period include Panama Viejo, El Hatillo, Nata, Miraflores, Guaniquito, Sitio Sierra, and El Caño. So, in summary of the prehistory to the modern era, the Central American land bridge, which is the Isthmus of Panama, featured plants, animals, and humans moving between North and South America. The first wave of human immigration occurred by at least 70,000 years ago, that is, across the Bering Land Bridge, and had to reach Panama within 10 millennia in order for it to get to Brazil by 55,000 years ago. By the end of the Pleistocene, some 10,500 years ago, contact between the native peoples who remained on this isthmus and other peoples living to the north and south had occurred, and the transfer of crops, technologies, and consumer goods proves this contact until by AD 600, when Nahuatl speakers, that is, Aztec language speakers, occupied the northwestern edge, Granicoya, of the isthmus, as we discussed in the previous chapter on Costa Rica. The ancestors of modern-day speakers of Chibchan and Chicoan languages underwent social and cultural diversification, mostly within the confines of the land bridge. Some residents altered vegetation immediately after first arrival. When they began to add domesticated crops to their subsistence inventory between 9,000 and 7,000 BP, such alteration was increased. Maize and manioc, that's corn and cassava, were domesticated north and south of the land bridge. Both were introduced in the period between 7,000 and 4,500 years ago. They gradually dominated regional horticulture and then agriculture. Human populations increased and spread into what had been relatively virgin areas. Diversity in material culture is visible by 6,000 BP and becomes more apparent after the introduction of pottery around 4,500 BP. Pottery has all of the features of manufacture and design, which are usually localized to different tribes and even households within these tribes, so they are good indications of different kinds of populations being in particular archaeological sites. The transition to the servitude epoch by 0 BC AD, so to speak, culture areas with distinctive artifact inventories are discernible, and between 500 BC and AD 700, hierarchies among regions, sites, social groups, and individuals proved the establishment of advanced theocratic chiefdoms and then actual class-divided state-organized kingdoms. These had high-ranked and/or ruling class members that demanded large amounts of sumptuary goods. They featured stone sculptures and monumental architecture. Central urban concentrations dominated over subordinated towns. Trade between productive bottomlands, highland valleys, and coastal habitats was typical. The modern era begins in the 1800s. By July 1831, as the new countries of Venezuela and Ecuador were being established, the isthmus demanded its independence also, first under General Alsuru as supreme military commander. Alsuru's short-lived administration defeated forces led by Colonel Tomas de Herrera. Afterwards, Alsuru was executed in August 1831, and ties with New Granada were resumed. In November of 1840, forces led by General Tomas Herrera, who had now assumed the title of Superior Civil Chief, declared their independence, as did many other emergent warlords. In March of 1841, the name of Estado Libre del Istmo, or the Free State of the Isthmus, was declared in what had been the Spanish polity of Panama. Herrera's creation established external political and economic ties and by March of 1841 they had drawn up a constitution. This document predicted reunification with New Granada, in which Panama would be a federal district. Herrera's title accordingly was changed to Superior Chief of State in March of 1841, and then changed again in June of 1841 to President. By the time the civil conflict ended, New Granada and the Isthmus had negotiated the reincorporation of Isthmus to the Union. Panama's first republic had been free for 13 months. Reunification happened on December 31st, 1841. Panama's fate was sealed by North American imperialism. In 1843, it had been 2 decades after the Monroe Doctrine declared U.S. intentions to be the dominant anti-European imperial power in the Western Hemisphere. This was the year that North American and French capitalists became excited about the prospect of constructing railroads and/or canals through Central America to quicken transoceanic travel. Now, the French were not about to accept the idea that the North Americans could enforce their Monroe Doctrine, and so they just had this fuck the gringos attitude. We'll go ahead and do whatever we want to do in Panama. Now, first, however, the gringos had to make New Granada's control over the Isthmus untenable. Then in 1846, the U.S. and New Granada signed the Bidlack-Mallarino Treaty, that granting the U.S. right-of-way across the Isthmus. To effect this right-of-way, the treaty gave the U.S. government the right to intervene militarily. The USA and France would fight each other in Mexico, and now in the Isthmus of Panama. But first the gringos had to fight their internal civil war. Then the Mexicans, with gringo support, expelled the French from Mexico, and then the French were expelled again from the Isthmus of Panama. So that is the kind of rough breakdown of how this French imperialism meets North American imperialism worked its way out. In the end, the North Americans created the union called the United States of Colombia. That was between 1863 and 1886. So you see, they got that started even in the middle of the U.S. Civil War. And as you recall, there was no doubt in Lincoln's mind that he was going to win the war. There was a doubt in his mind that he could get reelected in 1864. But as far as the North American bankers and capitalists were concerned, the defeat of the Confederacy was a foregone conclusion. And they were already busy in Mexico, as you know, and they were already busy in Panama. And later, in 1886 to 1903, the USA dictated the Panamanian inclusion into the Republic of Colombia. The gringos operating under their imposed 1846 Bidlack-Mallarino Treaty, or Mallarino Treaty, or the way North Americans would say it. Now, the Trans-Isthmus Railroad. You may not know it, but the world's first transcontinental railroad was not the one built by Dr. Durant in Hell on Wheels, but it was completed in 1855 across the isthmus of the Aspinwall, Cologne to Panama City area. Of course, this is using the term transcontinental in its broadest sense, referring to the narrowest portion of the New World as one continent, but at any rate, they did build the Panama Railway. Now, the U.S. used its troops to the same way in Panama that it had used them to defeat the Indians of the west of the plains in the United States when the railroad wanted to go through their lands. So U.S. troops were used to suppress separatist uprisings in Panama and social disturbances in that country on many occasions. The first conflict was the Watermelon War of 1856, wherein U.S. soldiers massacred civilians, caused armed resistance that the U.S. Marines would eventually be required to put down. Under a Federalist Constitution that was later brought up in 1858, and another one in 1863, when the U.S. Civil War was still underway, Panama and other constituent states gained almost complete autonomy on many levels of their administration. With Union victory in North America, Washington ensured that chaos reigned until Colombia's reorganization under U.S. dictate that happened in 1886. The upshot being the establishment of the contemporary Republic of Colombia. Now, in the post-independence, ruling class hegemony was established by 10 families. After independence, the colonial aristocracy of 10 extended families controlled Panama's administration. They and a few more families control much of today's economic and social life. Graham Greene's book, Getting to Know the General, and the Green-inspired movie, The Tailor of Panama, tells part of the story literally and cinematically. The term Rabi Blanco, or whitetail, has been used for many generations to refer to the usually Caucasian members of these ruling families. In 1852, the Isthmus adopted trial by jury in criminal cases, and 30 years later would abolish and enforce an end to slavery. Now let's take a look at the Panama Canal itself. In terms of origins, modern Panamanian history has been shaped by the recurrent theme of trans-isthmian commerce, and has often focused on the possibility of a canal to replace the difficult overland route. But as early as 1519, that's when Cortez was in Mexico, the Spanish crown built a cobbled track to join the oceans, the idea being to run the traffic Manila from Spain across this narrowest part of the New World and vice versa. By cobbled track, they mean kind of a primitive road which is made of rounded cobbles that they got out of rivers. Then the Pizarro brothers and their band of Ronin found that there was another New World Indian Empire in South America. Now the Spanish crown in Madrid got greedily involved, and by 1534 the Chagres River was dredged, and that facilitated traffic for 2/3 of the way across the isthmus. Suddenly this route was more than a way to facilitate the traffic of the Manila galleons to the Americas and then on to Iberia. It now funneled traffic to and from the silver mines of the Central Andes to Spain. Now, the contemporary history of the Panama is that French imperialism challenged Gringo imperialism again. In 1882, the French engineer Ferdinand de Lesseps of Suez Canal fame started work on a Panamanian canal. By 1889, with engineering challenges caused by frequent landslides, mud, loss of equipment, disease, the effort failed, and the de Lesseps firm went into bankruptcy. A new company was formed in 1894 to recuperate some of the losses of the original canal company. Now, U.S. banks had earlier conveniently entered the picture to discourage anyone funding de Lesseps as a way for U.S. imperialism to take over, which they did when U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt convinced the U.S. Congress to take on the abandoned de Lesseps works in 1902. The Gringos had been preparing the way by boycotting the financing of de Lesseps and by financing the forces of chaos in Colombia. Consequently, that nation was in the midst of a 1,000 Days War, an early kind of color revolution war. During the Colombian Civil War, there were at least 3 attempts by Panamanian Liberal Party partisans to seize control of Panama. They wanted full autonomy for what would be a new nation in which they would be the compradors of North American imperialism. Chief among them were liberal guerrillas Belisario Porras and Victoriano Lorenzo. Now, since the liberals, they're talking about the Liberal Party, failed to prevail, U.S. imperialism decided to back the Conservative Party. The Colombians and the U.S. sent military forces suppressing the liberals. The Gringos had all the authority they needed for this, as far as they were concerned, under the Moreno-Bidlack Treaty. The Teddy Roosevelt administration proposed to Colombia that the U.S. should control the canal. In mid-1903, the Colombian government refused, and the U.S. then changed tactics. According to the treaty, the U.S. was to pay $40 million to the stockholders of the French company that had tried to build the first canal across Panama. Colombia's rejection of the treaty confronted these French investors with the prospect of losing everything. At this point, the French company's chief lobbyist and a major stockholder, a man named Philippe Bunau-Varilla, went into action, justly confident that the Roosevelt administration would support his initiative. And he did this from a suite that he operated out of in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York. And from there, Bunau-Varilla arranged for the Panama City Fire Department to stage a revolution against Colombia. another one of these early gringo color revolutions. This is the U.S. Navy gunboat USS Nashville was dispatched to local waters around the city of Cologne, where 474 Colombian soldiers had landed to cross the isthmus and crush the rebellion. Nashville's commanding officer, Commander John Hubbard, sent a small party ashore, and with the support of the American superintendent of the Panama Railroad, prevented the Colombians from taking the train to Panama City. On November 3, 1903, after 57 years of policing Bogota's interests, the U.S. had sided with Panama. Less than 3 weeks later, on November 18, 1903, the Hay-Bonaveria Treaty was signed between the Frenchman Philippe Bonaveria and Mr. Hay, who was the Secretary of State, John Hay, of the United States. The latter had promptly been appointed Panamanian ambassador to the United States, and he represented Panamanian interests, and he signed that treaty along with the U.S. Secretary of State, John Hay. The treaty allowed for the construction of a canal and for U.S. sovereignty over a strip of land 10 miles wide and 50 miles long, with an additional 25 miles on either side of the canal. This, thus acquired Panama Canal Zone, belonged to the United States. Specifically in that zone, the U.S. would build a canal, then administer, fortify, and defend it in perpetuity. In fact, this was U.S. territory permanently. Theodore Roosevelt's explanation of the U.S. role in the region was made clear throughout many of his speeches after 1902. First, he would always invoke the Mallarino-Bidlack Treaty. Secondly, he made clear that Colombia had rejected his offers for a deal. And third, he argued that Colombia had never been able to prevent Panama from gaining its sovereignty anyway. On his December 7, 1903, Third Annual State of the Union address, Teddy Roosevelt enumerated an extensive list of intervention the U.S. Armed Forces had made in Panama since 1850. Explaining the above is only a partial list of the rebellions, revolutions, insurrections, riots, and other outbreaks that have occurred during the period in question. Yet they number 53 for the 53 years. And in addition, he added, in short, the experience of over half a century has shown Colombia utterly incapable of keeping order on the isthmus. Only the active interference of the United States has enabled her to preserve so much as a semblance of sovereignty. Had it not been for the exercise by the United States of the police power in her interest, her connection with the isthmus would have been sundered long ago. He's talking about the Colombian connection. Treaties like the Bidlack-Mallarino Treaty were considered legal under imperialist interpretation of U.S. law, although they involved U.S. interference in matters of a sovereign country. Roosevelt's speeches made clear that the U.S. decided to unilaterally break with the Bidlack-Mallarino Treaty, and instead of solving the internal Panamanian problem as the treaty stipulated, helped Panama to separate from Colombia. Thus it enforced only that part of the treaty that was of interest to the U.S., namely it granted the U.S. significant transit rights over the Panamanian Isthmus. It is common in Gringolandia to call these 1903 events Panama's independence from Colombia. However, Panamanians do not consider themselves former Colombians. They celebrate their independence from Spain on November 28, 1821, and separation from Colombia on November 3, 1903. At any rate, the Panama Canal was built by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers between 1904 and 1914. The current 50-mile Lock Canal is one of the world's greatest engineering triumphs. It is about to reopen with somewhat greater dimensions next year. Still, it will be far from sufficient to pass the world's largest tankers. This slack in Panama's ability to handle existing traffic, plus the additional trans-isthmus world traffic anticipated, allows Nicaragua's newer and much larger capacity canal the assurance of financial success. In short, there will be need for both canals, and both canals will be financially viable for centuries yet to come. On January 5, 1909, the government of Rafael Reyes in Colombia signed and presented to Congress a treaty that officially recognized the loss of its former province. Opposition to Reyes meant that negotiations continued until a new treaty was signed on December 21st of 1921 But this treaty formally accepted the independence of Panama. Not that it mattered, because Gringo imperialism had finished the canal a decade earlier, operating under the might makes right thesis. The Comintern was opposed to U.S. canal territory. It wasn't as if Teddy Roosevelt's policy of walking softly while carrying a big stick, and the canal company's de facto apartheid status for the canal zone, had not been much criticized. It had been, and vociferously so, especially in Latin America, and by the newly formed Comintern after 1990. Economic features. The U.S. financial injection to the country's economy and workforce, and the changes brought about by the canal venture, were overall positive for Panama. To sanitize the area before and during construction, the engineers developed an infrastructure to treat potable water, sewage, and garbage. This system encompassed the canal zone and the cities of Panama and Cologne.